Welcome to our next online talk in our Maxine Science Goes Public program. We are happy to have you with us again. Every Tuesday, scientists of our institute present parts of their life and work here in this format. We hope to have no technical or software programs this evening. I'd like to welcome today Meg Crofoot with us. She was born in Maine, USA, United States, studied human biology at Stanford University, and did her PhD in anthropology at Harvard University, am I right? And
Yes.
her postdoc at Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute and the Max Planck Institute for Ornithology. You were lecturer in the ecology and evolutionary department at Princeton University and assistant professor and associated professor at University of California, Davis. And Meg, you came here as the director of the third department at the Max Planck Institute of Animal Behavior, and you have a full Alexander Humboldt professorship at the University of Constance, and you came here in 2019. You are interested in the evolution of complex social systems, especially, I think, in primate social groups. And your talk today, the title is Stories from the Stone Age. I'm curious, and I want to know, how are you now here? Why did you choose Germany for your working and living place?
Well, the chance to come to Constance was just too good to pass up. It really is an amazing both academic community in terms of the sheer number of people here working on questions about animal interactions and how the interactions between individuals create these larger structures in which we all live. And then in addition to that, it's beautiful here. I'm really enjoying the spring, and it was just an amazing opportunity for me to take a new step in my career and with my family and in my life.
Dear audience, feel free to ask questions anytime in the chat. However, remember that you have to sign up in YouTube for this. After the talk, we will come back to all the questions and ask them to Meg. And now, Meg, I would like to hand over to you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Babette. I'm really excited to be here and to get this chance sort of to take you guys on a bit of an adventure. We've all been stuck inside, stuck in our houses, doing our best to be responsible and take care of each other through our behavior. But I have to say, I'm getting a little bit stir crazy. And so for me, it was a lot of fun to put this talk together and to get to think about how I wanted to share what has been, for me, one of the most exciting projects that I've been working on for the past few years, and one of the most unexpected. So today, I want to help break us out of, oh no, my slides are not advancing. That does not bode well.
Chris, can you help maybe?
Oh, there we go.
There we go. Okay, great.
So today, sorry about those technical difficulties. Hopefully got them out of the way at the beginning. Today what I want to do is give us all a chance to travel, get on a plane and travel from here in the Bodensee to Panama, where I've done much of my research over the course of my career. Panama is really a bridge between North and South America, and ends up acting as a gate between the oceans as well. And as such, it's a tremendously exciting place to do biological research. You have the communities of animals that evolved in South America intermingling with the North American fauna in Panama. You have the sea life of the Pacific touching the sea life of the Caribbean in the canal. And so Panama, for me, has been a very special place throughout my life. I met my husband there. Many of my closest, both professional and personal friends, professional colleagues and personal friends, my life sort of centers around Panama in many ways. And so what you're seeing here is a picture of downtown Panama City, which has been undergoing incredible change in the past 15 years, and even longer, but the 15 years I've been working in Panama. When I first arrived, there were only a handful of tall towers, and now you see a city of a forest of skyscrapers. But as you leave Panama City and travel out into the interior of the country, traveling west up the Inter-American Highway, you really leave that cosmopolitan part of Panama behind and enter a much more rural place where traffic jams look like this rather than cars. The Pacific coast of Panama is a relatively dry ecosystem that has a very special kind of tropical forest in it, which because of farming has been largely decimated. And so as we continue on to our field site, where I want to take you today, to introduce you to some of the research that we're trying to do to understand parts of how animal societies become complex. The next stage of our journey is by boat. So we've taken a plane, we've taken a bus, we're now on a boat, traveling out towards Coiba National Park, so Coiba National Park is a set of islands off the coast, the Pacific coast of Panama, and is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, in part because of its tremendous marine biodiversity. As you travel out on a boat, you might see spinner dolphins, there are whale sharks, sharks of all varieties, just amazing, tremendously dense and diverse marine community. And you're also going to pass by Coiba. And so if you look at this map, you'll notice that Coiba looks very dark green in comparison to what the mainland looks like. The mainland is much more denuded. So Coiba is I think the largest parcel of a Pacific dry forest left in Central America. And so as such, it is incredibly important from a conservation perspective. It's also a very interesting place because it harbors a number of endemic species that are found nowhere else in the world. So you might ask yourself, why is the Coiban ecosystem still so intact? And the reason actually comes back to the history of what the archipelago has been used for in recent history. And so Coiba and the island of Jicaron, which is just south of Coiba, were both used as high security prisons for much of the last century. They housed both some of the most dangerous criminals, but also political prisoners. And so there's a long history of this place, anthropologically and sociologically, as a prison. The prison is now closed, and in fact, it was the fact that it was a prison that saved the ecosystem on the island. So when you pass Coiba and arrive south onto the island of Jicaron, where we work, you sort of find yourself landing in something that feels a bit like a tropical paradise. It really feels like you are at the end of the world. You're incredibly far from anything and everything. There's no infrastructure on this island. There are no people who live on this island. And it has this feeling of being this pure, pristine place, removed from the world. And it's a really special feeling these days. The way we have traveled has made the world much smaller, but to get to be in a place where comparatively few people ever go really is a real privilege and it has a very special feel to it. And so I sort of want us to sit on this beach for a moment to talk about why we came here in the first place. Broadly speaking, what I'm interested in is how complex animal societies came to be. How do we get social complexity? And one of the reasons that I'm interested in this question is because we ourselves, human beings, are an unusually complex animal. socially complex animal. Our uniqueness, what makes us stand out from other animals on this planet, isn't so much about the characteristics of any particular individual or any particular human being. It's about what happens when you bring groups of people together to interact. We're hypersocial. We're uniquely flexible in terms of how we arrange our societies. And we have an unusual capacity to work together to achieve large goals. So, you know, we are a human primate. And what that means is that we're part of a larger family of species that also live in complex social groups, and with whom we share a number of important characteristics. So just to remind you, it's perhaps been, if you knew this, you may have already forgotten. But so humans are primates. Our closest relatives are the chimpanzees and bonobos. We shared a last common ancestor with them about 5.5, 6 million years ago. The date shifts around, but in that ballpark. And we are an ape. So we are also closely related to gorillas, orangutans, slightly more distantly to gibbons. And then to a range of Old World and New World primates. So primates that live in Asia and Africa, as well as the primates that live in Central and South America. And one of what that means, what it means that we are a human primate, is that we share some very interesting features of both our morphology, our physiology, and our behavior. So importantly, we have hands that can grasp. So think about your hand and what your hand can do in comparison to what your dog's paw can do. It gives us the ability to manipulate objects in a much finer ways than many other species. We also have forward-facing eyes, which give us really good 3D or stereoscopic vision. Interestingly, primates in general have there's a pattern of brain expansion that happens over the primate lineage. We have very big brains, but primates in general also have large brains. And one effect of this seems to be that we have very expensive babies. Our babies have big brains, they take a long time to grow, we have long pregnancies, long periods of dependency, and our babies are born very helpless. And part of what all of this means is that complex social groups in primates, it's not a bonus. It's in fact a necessity. You have to have this kind of high-level social interaction for primate infants to thrive in many cases. So that's what it means to be a human primate. And although there are all of these similarities, humans really are very strange primates in some ways. And I think this picture really epitomizes what makes us such a strange primate. What you're seeing here is the International Space Station. And there are three things that make something as enormous as this accomplishment, this achievement possible. One is that you have to be able to cooperate at enormous scales with non-family, non-kin members. And you have to be able to do it with individuals that you've never met before, that you have no history of interaction and sort of built up trust with. So large-scale non-kin cooperation is required for this kind of achievement. You also have to have the ability to divide labor. Not everybody can be a specialist and know how to do every part of a job as big as something like building and putting into space this amazing orbiting system. The third thing that really stands out when you think about something like the International Space Station is that it requires the ability to learn from others and for that knowledge to accumulate. So it requires a culture that can accumulate over time. So I learn how to do something, I can teach my daughter. She doesn't have to start from ground zero. She can build upon the accomplishments of the people who came before her. And those are three characteristics that really are, if not uniquely human, then uniquely well developed in our species and in our societies. And so really what I focus on, understand how we bridge the gap between the kinds of complexity we see in the societies of other animal species and the kinds of complexity we see in human societies. And that's really where stone tools come in. So in some ways, stone tools are one of those first elements of a cumulative culture, going from very, very simple, just using a stone to bash open nuts, to the kinds of very complex stone tool making that we see in our hominin ancestors. stone tools are also of particular interest because they preserve well. So they're the earliest record that we have of human culture. It's how we can trace human culture through most of our prehistory. And tools were really thought to be the defining trait of our species for a long time. When we thought of what made man different, man was the tool maker. Of course, decades of research by field biologists in a range of systems have shown that we are not alone in our capacity to make and use tools. Chimpanzees use strip sticks of their leaves in order to fish for termites. Dolphins use pieces of sponge to protect their mouths and nose when they're foraging in the sand and rocks. And a number of primates, including 2 monkey species, are known to use stone tools. Birds also use tools, and the corvids in particular are particularly adept at both, not only at using, but also at making tools to accomplish goals. So we know that that there are other species on this planet who do what we do, who have these sorts of material cultures. But the reason that I ended up coming to Coiba National Park and to Jicaron in particular was the result of a chance encounter I had over coffee when I was a postdoc in Panama with a colleague of mine, Alicia Ibanez, who's a botanist and who'd been spending time on these islands and had seen this species, white-faced capuchin monkeys, using stone tools. And she hadn't thought anything of it because she's a botanist and she's like, oh, that's interesting. She took some pictures. But when she told me about this, I got very excited because this is a species that had never before been documented to use stone tools anywhere where it's studied. And this is one of the best studied primates in the world. There are numerous, more than 30-year studies of many groups of the species in Costa Rica that have documented many interesting cultural behaviors. So this is a species that has the capacity to develop cultural traditions. So for example, the capuchins at Susan Perry's field site in Lomas Barbadal in Costa Rica have these bizarre, what we think are greeting rituals, where they will stick their fingers into each other's eye sockets and just sit there with your finger inserted up to its second digit in one of your group mates' eye sockets, while that group mate just sits there and tolerates it. We don't know what the purpose of this is, but we can document, and Susan has documented, that this behavior can spread through groups, can be transmitted it can be innovated by one individual and spread through their group. It can also be taken from one group to another group when monkeys immigrate. So they have all of the pieces for us to see stone tool use or other kinds of tool use. But interestingly, in all of these years of study, no one had ever observed the species actually using tools. Other cultural traditions, yes, but no tools. And so this is really what sort of got me excited about going on this adventure. And it really has been an adventure. It's been one of the most uncertain scientific undertakings I've ever taken part in. And we really got a leg up by an initiative called the BioBlitz, which was organized by Christian Ziegler and Omar Lopez. And the purpose of this BioBlitz was to document the biodiversity in Coiba in hopes of helping to protect its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And as part of this BioBlitz, experts in all different kinds of taxonomic groups went out to Coiba and documented as many species as possible using a variety of methods, misnetting birds and bats, collecting insects, a variety of different methods being used. And to census the mammal community, they relied on camera traps. And one of the interesting things that they found, and this was work being led by Claudio Montesa, they found an extraordinary number of pictures of capuchin monkeys on the ground. Now, normally capuchins are an arboreal species. They mostly live in the trees. And if you go to any particular site where there are capuchins in the forest and you were to be place camera traps on the ground, you would catch some capuchins. In particular, they seem to like to take selfies. I think they're curious about the camera, or potentially seeing their reflection. But so you would get some pictures of capuchins on the ground. But on Cueva, and particularly on Jicarón, you don't just get some pictures. You get many, many, many pictures. And not only are capuchins apparently spending a lot of time on the ground on these two islands, an unusual amount of time on the ground, you're also seeing activities and individuals that you would not expect to see based on what we know from other field sites. So what you're seeing here is a mother with a very young infant. The forehead is still gray, on the ground. That infant is presumably very vulnerable, and it's very unusual to see females with babies down on the ground in other field sites. You see entire groups traveling on the ground. And you even see individuals lying down to nap on the ground. So all of these are very unusual behaviors. And it got us asking questions about what was different about this site. So to try to answer that, we've done a comparison between the data, the information that we can get from camera trapping out on this island archipelago in the Pacific, on Cueva and Jicarón Islands, and comparing that to data that we have from camera traps that were placed in central Panama, more in the core of the Capuchins range, at 3 different sites. And what we find is that indeed, the Capuchins on Cueva and Jicarón are spending much more time on the ground than at any of these other sort of mainland sites. And just to point out, the y-axis here is on a log scale. So it's an order of magnitude difference in how much we are capturing, how frequently we're capturing capuchins on the ground on this archipelago. Now, to understand why that might be and what might be going on with this population, I think it's really important to dive a little bit into the geology. So the Cuevan archipelago is actually part of the Galapagos hotspot that has then moved into and crashed into the Central American plate. And it was attached to the rest of Panama up until about 15,000 years ago. But for the past 12 to 18,000 years, but 15-ish, it has been separated by a significant oceanic barrier from the rest of the mainland. So these capuchins on these 2 islands have been isolated from other capuchins for at least 15,000 years. And as a result of that, we see changes not only in the community of animals that they're living with, but also who they're competing with for food and who they're being preyed upon. So if you look at the mammal community in central Panama, at these what we're calling mainland sites, you see a rich community of mammals, dozens of species, of which what you're seeing here is a subsampling that show up on camera traps. So camera traps are, of course, biased against small animals or arboreal animals. But you see, in addition to capuchins, you might see tyra and agouti, tapir, tamandua, which are an anteater, capybara, which are the biggest rodent in the world. So it's a rich community. When you move out to Cueva, you lose most of that diversity. And this is a pattern that we see on islands. Islands tend to not be able to support the same diversity of animal species that you see. And it's sort of, there's a strong relationship between the size of an island and the distance it is from the mainland and how rich its animal community will be. So in Cueva, you have many fewer animal species. The capuchins are there with deer, some possums, howler monkeys, and agouti. And by the time you get to Jicarón, there are only 4 mammal species that are living in this habitat. So that potentially really changes both the dynamics of who capuchins are competing with for food, and therefore what resources might be available to them on the ground. But it also dramatically changes the risks of foraging on the ground. So if you look at the sites in mainland Panama, on Barro Colorado Island here, and the surrounding national monument peninsulas, as well as in Soberania National Park, what you're seeing in this graph is the encounter rates with different predators. And in all 3 of these sites, you see ocelot regularly at quite high abundance. There are tyra there are jaguarundi, and there are even coyote, which are slowly working their way down from North America into South America and crossed the Panama Canal for the first time a few years ago. In contrast, in Coiba and Jicaron, these species are entirely absent. Capuchins don't have any terrestrial predators in this island ecosystem. And so what we think that means for these capuchins is that they are freed from the constraints of predation risk. They can come down to the ground more freely. And this may really open up opportunities for experimenting and innovating, which may be critical for developing traditions like tool use. So this was all work that had been done before anyone from my research group went to Coiba. And it told us some really interesting things about how the capuchins in Coiba were different from the rest of the populations that are quite well studied at this point. But to really start to tackle questions about their tool use, to see if we could document it for the first time, to actually have both proof that it was happening and to understand the patterns the patterns of behavior that are happening on these islands. We had to get out to this beautiful stretch of beach, which is not anywhere near where you can land a boat. There are a couple challenges, but there are numerous challenges to working on Coiba. In addition to being really remote, the sites that we are most interested in can only be accessed via the coast. You can't go inland. The topography and terrain just doesn't allow it. So you have to walk along the beach. And there's only about a 2-hour window around low tide where it's possible to do that. Otherwise, you end up sort of getting trapped by the tides between pinch points. And it's quite a rough coast. In addition, because it's so remote, probably, Jicaron is a major stopover point for cocaine traveling north from Colombia to the US. And so this was a drug bust that was found on exactly the bit of coast where we work in January, which prevented us from going out there for the field season because it wasn't safe. So in addition to not wanting to get stuck by the tide, we don't particularly want to run into either people moving drugs or the police looking for people moving drugs. But so with those caveats in mind, we set off. And passing one of the pinch points, it's about a 3, depending on how in shape you are, somewhere between a 2 and a 3-hour walk. And we have to hike in all of our water and all of our food. It's exhausting, but you get back up and you walk some more in the very hot sun, and you eventually arrive. I think I'm still alive in this picture. And what all of that effort gets you in the end is some of the most exciting footage that I've ever been able to collect in my career. And it's really exciting to get to sort of be part of a discovery of something new. And so using camera traps, we've been monitoring a number of anvils. So this is actually the exact same anvil that my friend Alicia had told me about years ago now, that is still in use by the capuchins on a daily basis. And what you're seeing here is a big male capuchin using a stone, a hammerstone, to bash open the nuts of Terminalia catapa, this species of plant that lives along the coast and that has these very calorie-rich nuts inside, but that can't be accessed without using stone tools to crack them open. We're also able to document completely remotely. So we just go out there to put out camera traps, pick up the old camera traps, change the batteries, take out the memory cards, replace the memory cards, and sort of do this maintenance work, as well as some archaeology on these sites. We're not sitting and observing these animals because it's not safe to be out there and it's not logistically feasible to be out there for long periods of time. But we still managed to capture tremendously rich behavioral data on what the stone tool use, what kinds of resources they're accessing, how they're accessing them. This guy seems to be looking, that we think there's an embedded insect inside that stone, inside that wood that he's trying to access by bashing it open. And I want you to notice how big that stone is compared to him, to the size of the monkey. That monkey is probably 3 to 3.5 kilograms. And that is, so the rock probably weighs about 1/3 of his weight. It's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into this nut cracking behavior. We also see capuchins carrying both stones and food sources, so nuts, to and from these anvils that they use. They seem to have preferred places to do nut cracking. And so we see them lugging big stones from the stream bed up to where they want to be working. And finally, we were quite jealous of this guy because they had eaten all the coconuts, but they also crack open and drink coconut water, which, as you can see, this riverbed is dry right now. There are times of year that are very, 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 very dry on Jicaron and on this part of Panama in general. Hello. And so the role that being able to access water from these coconuts plays, I think, is potentially very interesting. So as I said, all the work that we do out here is remote. We set up camera traps. We do basic art. We do archaeology with collaborators, recording the dimensions and weighing and mapping, measuring stone tools, as well as mapping these archaeological sites where they're doing nut cracking, and also coming up with ingenious ways to try to trick capuchins into giving us hair samples so that we can do genetics on them to understand how they relate, how the capuchins on Jicaron relate to the capuchins on Coiba and to the mainland populations nearby. And it's been a tremendously exciting opportunity to work with a great group of young Panamanian scientists, each of whom have different specialties. So Zar Luis on the left is a botanist, Claudia Montesa in the middle is a mammologist, and Pedro on the right is an ornithologist. And so having this diverse group of people working with us has been really exciting because it's also meant that we've been able to do some basic natural history of this underexplored ecosystem. So for example, the last time we were there, we observed a coral snake, which is the first time it extends the range of coral snakes further south and west. So what do we know? Well, the answer is after 3 years of doing this, there are still more questions than answers. We've been able to document the really central role that tool use plays in these monkeys' lives. These groups of capuchins that use these sites are coming on a nearly daily basis throughout the year, year-round. They're spending significant periods of time at these sites. And a lot of their social lives seems to revolve around these areas where they're also using stone tools. Interestingly, the tool use is highly localized on the island. There's only one or maybe two groups that seem to be doing this. We've been surveying the rest of Jicaron intensively, as well as Coiba, and have not found evidence of this behavior anywhere else, which raises questions. Why this group? Why here? Why not elsewhere? As far as we can tell, all of the things that you would need, the rocks, the nuts, the anvils, they exist everywhere. They're not limited. So why only these groups? In capuchins, males usually leave their group at puberty, or at sexual maturity, and join a new group. One would think that they would be able to bring this tradition with them. We don't know why they don't. In addition, despite the fact that males of all sizes, little guys, big guys, immatures, old and almost decrepit individuals, they all use stone tools. Females don't seem to. So in all of the camera trapping we've done on Jicaron, females don't use tools. Although they are there, they're on the ground, they're around, but they're not doing the nut cracking behavior, even though they're as big as many of the males that we see doing it. And I now get to give two caveats, because actually, just before COVID shut down our ability to get back out there, we discovered some really exciting things. So in our breaking news to us, we've now discovered a second population of capuchins up on the mainland part of Coiba that are also using stone tools. And we have documented a female at these sites using stone tools. And what this means, we're still figuring it out. But it's interesting. The existence of two populations doing this behavior suggests that it has been innovated at least twice. It's unlikely that an animal from this part of Jicaron crossed the 6 miles of ocean and the entire Coiba Island to bring a tradition north or the other direction. So most likely, some individual in these groups invented this tradition. independently. So that's interesting. It's interesting as well that in the site in Koiba, the females seem to be using stone tools, whereas in Heron they don't. So these are all questions that I think are going to be really exciting to push forward with in, well, once we can get back into the field and continue with this research. And just in general, we have so much more work to do from the data that we already have. It's actually a nice time in some ways with COVID, because we get to sit down with the 3 years of video and pictures that we have to try to understand, are Capuchins learning how to do this from their group mates, or are they figuring it out by themselves? Is it socially facilitated, or is there any evidence of active teaching? Why? What is going on with females? Why aren't they doing this? Do they start trying when they're juveniles and stop? Do they never do it? And questions as well about what impact this is having both on the ecology and on the social behavior of the species. They seem unusually tolerant of each other, and I think there's some really interesting within group dynamics, social dynamics that may result from this tool use. So that's a bit of a whirlwind trip through what is currently one of my favorite research projects and one of my favorite places in the world. It's a really beautiful thing to get to do research at the end of the earth. And I'm going to leave you with the one downside to working on Koiba, which are, these are the Halloween crabs that absolutely cover the entire island in March when we go, at the time when we go, and that writhe in the leaf litter. You can see the whole leaf litter undulating as if it were water because there are so many crabs. And so I guess I want to finish by thanking particularly Claudio Montesa and Brendan Barrett, who are the two scientists really driving this research and doing the vast majority of the hard field work that has given us these insights. Alicia Ibanez for noticing this and telling us about it, and then being willing to help us continue working in the system. And Christian Ziegler. So any photographs that were not attributed here were all Christian Ziegler's work. And he not only organized the original Koiba BioBlitz, which really brought attention to this interesting ecosystem, but has been working with us to document what we do and to tell our stories. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much, Meg. This was really interesting. And I think there are lots still for you, lots of open questions on this island or in this work, yeah.
Part of what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, it is. And I know also that you are also always, yeah, very interested to do a lot of outreach. So we really like to hear over more years, maybe more about this. When have you been the first time there? I didn't get it, sis, maybe.
I went for the first time in 2010, but Brendan really started up this work in 2016. So we've been doing sort of the more consistent monitoring since then.
Yeah. So we have here one question. This is, are there more islands with a remarkable wildlife that is not a lot different from the wildlife on the mainland?
Yeah, island ecosystems. Oh,
Sorry, that is a lot different from the wildlife on the mainland, yeah?
Yeah, so island ecosystems are fascinating, both because the separation means that you oftentimes do get the evolution of new species on islands. And also because even when you don't have a speciation event, there's a tendency for animals to either get bigger or smaller living in island ecosystems, possibly or likely because related to how the ecology, the food availability, the sorts of pressures that they experience impact them. So if you think about, for example, Homo floresiensis, colloquially they called him the hobbit. It was a very small human ancestor found on islands, the island of Flores off of Indonesia. So yeah, island ecosystems are fascinating places, and I think I'm particularly interested in the role that they may play in behavioral diversity, not just species diversity or biodiversity, but behavioral diversity, because islands present animals with different challenges than mainland populations face. They often have less resources. Island ecosystems get disrupted more by storms, by wind. They're the exposure to the ocean really changes those dynamics, and they also have different sort of community dynamics. So the composition of the other animals that they're competing with or trying to avoid being eaten by can be quite different. And so I think, to me, one of the things that working on Hikaron and on this project has really highlighted is the importance for us when we talk about what it means to conserve and preserve our natural heritage for future generations. It's not just a question of species, because you have behavioral diversity that with every population, with every group, for example, of primates that disappears, you're losing behavioral and cultural diversity as well.
Yes. Another question, how often have you been on this island for research?
So our group goes 3 or 4 times a year to switch out, to do this sort of maintenance of the research infrastructure, to switch out camera traps, bring new camera traps to replace ones that have broken, to do the basic archaeology that we do, and there are a few other types of data. So we go 3 or 4 times a year. I don't go every time, but the group goes 3 or 4 times a year.
So how many people would go are in the group then?
It can be done with 4, but oftentimes, somewhere between 4 and 10, depending on which parts are the focus and whether we're trying to do a new data collection or just maintain the long-term data collection.
And concerning this, one more question: how is it with? Do you need any allowance or any permission to go on that island, or how does this work?
Yes. So to do research in Panama, you need to have, of course, permission from Mi Ambiente, which is the governmental organization that controls that oversees the natural resources, including national parks. You also have to have permission from the national park, the local national parks itself. And Hikaron is not really, this is not really a tourist, this is not a place that's sort of accessible to tourists. So you also have to have, like, you have to be able to have the infrastructure to get out there. So we camp, we have to bring in and bring out all of our food. It's not set up for human habitation.
So, but it's not limited to persons you take with you. If you need 5 people, then it's okay. If you need 10, it's also okay.
Yes, yeah, we have the ability to include new people on our permits to take the research in new directions. So, for example, one of the last times that we were out there, we had we brought a couple of extra people who specialize in climbing trees, because we're very interested in what the capuchins are doing in the trees, like whether they are still using the trees in the same way that populations on the mainland do, or if they're perhaps not using it at all. And because we can't do direct behavioral observation, this may be the next best way of getting that and figuring that out.
The next question is, how do the capuchins react to human presence? Were they shy or fearless face to your researcher group?
Yeah, so these capuchins are not habituated to humans, and they behave, they are shy. Capuchins in general, personality-wise, they're a bit pugnacious. They are, they have quite a lot of bravado and swagger, is how I would describe them. So a typical response of a capuchin to humans, at least at first, would be to try to threaten you and get up in your, sort of shake branches, perform coalitions, sort of threatening coalitions towards you. But right, for the work that we do, we actually want these animals to retain some fear of humans. We don't want them to end up becoming habituated and have that potentially put them in harm's way later down the road.
Another question, would it be correct to say that lack of predators and abundance of food might be the key factors which motivate tool use behavior?
Yeah, I certainly think, I think that that's a big open question. I think that the lack of predators is likely to be important because it allows you to be on the ground safely. If you imagine trying to use a stone tool up in a tree, for example, every time you miss, the stone falls to the ground. It doesn't seem very conducive conditions to this becoming not only innovation, but then it's spreading through a population because it's useful. I think the other thing about stone tool use is that it requires concentration and is loud. And so if you're doing that when there are predators around, you're probably quite vulnerable. So yes, I expect that reduced risk from predators is probably important. The role that food plays is really interesting. And I don't, it may be, there are fewer competitors on these islands, but there also is less diversity of tree species. And so it may actually be lack of or less food, restricted food resource availability that might promote using stone tools to access foods that wouldn't be accessible otherwise. So breaking open these nuts that you couldn't get into. The other thing that we know is going on in this system, but we have not yet been able to document very well, is we know they're using the intertidal zone and that they're breaking open clams and bivalves, other sorts of aquatic marine resources. Unfortunately, every time we put a camera trap facing the beach, it gets destroyed. We assume by people moving drugs up and down the beach. So we've stopped doing that for the moment.
Okay.
And yeah, but we know that it's happening. We've caught it. We've seen it a few times, and we've caught it on a couple of camera traps that weren't destroyed.
Okay. Another question is, in an evolutionary time scale, how far apart is anvil tool use from human hammerstone tool use? And what are some biological differences between the two tool use types?
Yeah, well, so they're independent innovations. So the New World monkeys, which include capuchins, split off from the lineage that led to human ancestors about 40 million years ago. It's actually an amazing story because given what we know about what the world looked like at the time that this split happened, what we think must have happened is that these monkeys rafted across the ocean to South America. There was no land connection at this time. So that's sort of an amazing story in and of itself. So the divergence time, so they're 40 million years separated from our lineage. The behavior itself, we of course can't say. We don't know when this population invented this tradition. We don't know how long it's been going on. We can tell from the work that we do at these anvil sites that it's been going on for many, many years. We know from observations at least 10, based on Alicia's first sighting of this behavior. But when you look at the depositions of all of these cracked nuts, it seems like it's been going on much longer than that. In terms of the biological differences with how humans use stone tools, one of the things you maybe noticed in the video is when capuchins are using these stone tools, they're using both hands on the stone, they're raising it above their head and bringing it down very forcefully on the nut. And it's really hard to be precise when you're doing that. You don't have a lot of sort of fine control. And what that means is that they have to bash at the nuts many, many times. Whereas we think in terms of human hammerstone tool use, because of sort of this, both our size, our grasping hand, that if you can do one-handed cracking, it's much more precise and probably much more efficient, probably.
Mm-hmm. We have another question. From point of view of showing a development in isolation, do you think it is allowed to compare your island with the Galapagos Islands, and do you intend to do research there?
So it's certainly interesting in the sense that, this island chain is actually geologically part of the Galapagos. So they were volcanoes that passed over the Galapagos hotspot. And they do share some aspects with the Galapagos, but of course they are much closer to land. They're not nearly as isolated. And so when you look at, the population, the community of animals that are living on Coiba and Jicaron, it's a much larger community, more diverse community than lives on the Galapagos, at least in terms of the non-introduced species. And I think in general, there's a lot to be learned about the role from island ecosystems, specifically, I think, with regards to tool use. So earlier towards the beginning of the presentation, I showed a picture of a macaque with a stone tool down on the ocean. A number of the populations and species that are known to use stone tools are island dwelling. And I think it's possible that that's just a coincidence, but it's also possible that there's something specific about island ecologies that make tool use more likely to be developed, tool use traditions more likely to arise and to be sort of perpetuated. And it might be the availability of things like bivalves, so oysters and clams, as an alternate food source. It may be this particular nut that they crack is in Jicaron and Coiba. It's the same species of nut that they crack in Thailand, these macaques. And so I think there are other islands that have primate populations and where there have been hints and rumors of tool use. And so I think continuing to explore that, continuing to discover new populations would be really exciting.
Mm-hmm. Another question, could it be possible that the ancestors of the present Capuchinis copied the use of tools from the former prisoners on the island?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess I would expect that the answer is no. The prisoners hunted a lot of the wildlife on the island, so I would imagine that the Capuchins didn't spend a whole lot of time hanging around and observing them. And in general, there's very little evidence of primates, or Capuchins at least, learning, wild populations of Capuchins learning from or picking up sort of the behaviors of humans that they live in proximity to. That being said, Capuchins are one of the biggest brained primates. They are incredibly trainable. So you see them on television in movies and sitcoms because they have tremendous capacity to learn. So it certainly couldn't be ruled out.
I was very fascinated that I have the idea that they really like to make selfies or photos from themselves. Do you understand this?
I don't. They are what Capuchins are curious about versus what they are afraid of is, to me, still kind of a mystery. At another site where I work, where sort of my long-term observational research on Capuchins is, we have been trying to get them to come to these platforms so we can sort of set up some experiments in the wild, and getting them to approach these platforms has just been so much work with so little success because they're so afraid of new things in that context. But somehow they are not afraid of the camera traps. And I think, it's fascinating. Something that I'm interested in, I sort of have the sense that we see more selfies on Coiba and Jicaron than we do at other sites, even once you account for the difference in the rates at which we capture them. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the Capuchins on these two islands are perhaps less neophobic, less afraid of new things, which might also help sort of explain innovation.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't experience that yet, so
we don't have an answer yet. No.
So they weren't afraid of your tent or something less or more than the other.
Well, you may have noticed in some of the videos that there is quite a lot of trash on the island. So it washes in off the Pacific,
Okay.
just tremendous, obscene quantities of plastic that just, depending on what the tides have been, that just coat the beach. Sometimes you're walking through 1.5 feet worth of plastic everywhere in these sites, and so the monkeys see lots of human detritus, human trash, and they don't seem scared of it, but nor do they really do much with it as far as we can tell.
Mm-hmm.
But it is one of the more heartbreaking things about this site, is it just makes you realize where all the flip-flops and Crocs in the world go. You could shoe shop on this beach for any color or any pair of plastic sandal imaginable.
Okay. There's a pity, or maybe we find something which can also change plastic in something. You never know.
No.
We just read something today somewhere, so about I don't know how to give it. Well, anyway, maybe it will change. I don't see any more questions, Meg, and I think it was a really nice talk and also very nice questions, I have the feeling. And I hope we can have you also soonish with the youngsters.
That would be lovely. I look forward to it.
Yeah, and I hope maybe we can. I always wanted to go also with them, with a group of young students to Panama. Maybe we can one day realize that together.
That would be a nice goal to work towards.
Yeah, and I thank you very much. I have to say again, I really liked it. Hope to have you more often and something like this also. And I would like to announce also the next talk, which will be next Tuesday. And it's the first talk of one of these young scientists for adults. It's from Hannes. He is with us since 2-3 years. He's an incredible ornithologist, young. He's, I think, 15, 16 now. And he was for 2 or 3 months in Costa Rica. This talk will be in German, and he will take us to Costa Rica and show us his fascinating photos from the birds there. And don't forget to subscribe this channel or follow us via Instagram or send us an email so we can put you on our infos for emails on our newsletter. Thanks very much for being here. Have a good evening and goodbye.